Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today we have a prominent scholar and philosopher, Professor Osman Bakar. He went to Temple University, Philadelphia in the early 1981 to pursue his doctoral studies in Islamic philosophy of science, which was published as Classification of Knowledge in Islam. He became a professor in 1992, an expert of philosophy of science. And then he was a Fulbright visiting scholar, Department of History of Science in Harvard University, where he studied mathematics in Muslim culture. So he was working on Islam and science and Southeast Asia for decades. Let's hear from him today. Welcome, Professor.
That's good. Thank you.
Could you talk about your journey of Islamic philosophy, how it's changed the Southeast Asian nature of study on Islam?
All right. It all began with my decision to leave behind the mathematics which I was pursuing at London University for both my first degree, Bachelor of Mathematics, and Master of Science, specializing in algebra. That was in 1971, and then I went to register for my PhD in mathematics. But during that period, I began reading a lot of books on philosophy, on religion, and eventually I was so immersed in these two fields, philosophy and religion, that I decided that I do not want to go ahead with a PhD in mathematics. I told my sponsor of my study leave, the National University of Malaysia in Kuala Lumpur, telling that I would like to go for another area of study for my PhD. But of course, at that time, the thinking was I was out of place really. I mean, so they told me to come back. They do not approve my request. Basically, at that time, not possible to change discipline in the course in the middle of of the sponsorship. So I went back to Malaysia and became a lecturer, still teaching mathematics, but I was also given permission by university to teach two courses, one a compulsory course on the history of science in Islamic civilization, and another course which is elective on the philosophy of science for final year science students. And that was the beginning, actually, of the journey. Yeah.
Yeah, great to hear that. Especially, we can see these kind of things in Islamic philosophy, or Ibn Arabi was mixing mathematics with this kind of Islamic philosophy and science. Have you?
Yes.
Could you comment on that, or do you have any influence?
Well, actually, certainly, what I experienced was nothing new if we refer to the past history of Islamic civilization. In fact, there was quite, something which was quite common. So very, very common in the classical Islamic civilization to see scholars, having knowledge and expertise in more than one discipline. The idea of having just one discipline, that is a modern thing. That's already a modern basis. With specialization, you have to specialize in one discipline. But that was not the case in the past. Yeah, I could name so many. Yeah, Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Al-Ghazali, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, yeah, Al-Biruni, all this. I mean, polymath. They are polymaths. I mean, they are knowledgeable in more than one discipline. And then the interesting thing is that their knowledge in these different fields do not lead to a kind of intellectual clash. There was no clash. I mean, they saw unity of knowledge, which is precisely what Tawheed, Tawheed epistemology is all about. Yeah. So it's nothing new. But for the Muslim world in our time, it is something rare, something, and of course I face this challenge, to move from one discipline to another is something not well accepted by the university. So I was fortunate that after teaching mathematics and history of science in Islamic civilization at the National University, I was lucky that the Vice Chancellor of the oldest university in Malaysia, University of Malaya, invited me to go to his university because he has just introduced a program on history and philosophy of science. So, and then he later he gave me study leave to go to Temple University to do a PhD in Islamic philosophy of science under the supervision of Professor Nasser. So I was, because the Vice Chancellor himself was a fan, or rather he likes very much the writings of Professor Nasser. So he said, please go and study with him. So that what happened. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. So could you explain about the book, the classification of knowledge in Islam, how it happened, how it influenced later on?
Yes. Actually, that book was exactly the PhD thesis that I presented to the Department of Religion, Temple University, Philadelphia. This is the only slight change, of course. The title of my thesis, the exact title of my thesis was Classification of the Sciences in Islamic Intellectual History, Studies in Philosophies of Science. But when I published that thesis, I simplified the title. The title was too long. So I just put the title as Classification of Knowledge in Islam, which to my surprise, appeal, had a great appeal among many people. In fact, until today, that book remains my best work, my best known work, this classification of knowledge in Islam, which has been translated into many Muslim languages. At first, the Indonesian Malay language, and then to Turkish, to Persian, to this Albanian, and so many languages. Now it is also translated into Arabic. So I'm very happy that this book has been used as textbooks in several Muslim universities.
Great. Let's talk about this another book, the Tawheed and Science. That's how you were, incorporating these two things in your book.
So this is another book published at the same time. Published at the same time as Classification of Knowledge in Islam. The only difference, the Tawheed and Science is a collection of essays. So it's not as difficult as Classification of Knowledge, this is more the popular level in trying to understand the multi-dimensional relationship between Islam and science, and the core of Islam is of course Tawheed. So why that's the title. But in terms of the time of writing the materials, it's about the same time. In fact, most of the articles, most of the chapters in Tawheed and science were actually my term papers and in my postgraduate during when I was doing my MA, for my PhD coursework, and the requirement at Temple University was that we have to take a minimum of 8 courses, 8 courses. Each course carries the value of 3 credit hours. But the point is, I tried to make it happen. That my turn papers, I will consult the professors who taught the course, whether I should publish, and they recommend that, and most of them did not go much change, in other words, almost the same as my term paper, so, and also some of the papers I presented at international seminars. One was, which I remember very much, is so meaningful to me. One of the articles that I presented was at Al-Ghazali University, Al-Ghazali Muslim Al-Ghazali University in India. But in terms of the content, there is a variety of themes. In other words, but the unifying themes, of course, is Tawheed and science. Looking at the relationship between the doctrine of Tawheed, the unity of God or divine unity, but apply it to the field of knowledge, of different branches of knowledge. This book also, I'm very, very happy that in terms of popularity, it has also been translated to many different languages. So the 2 books are the best, my best writings.
Yeah, then you are shifting to a number of books you wrote later on. I think you have 40 number of books from your side, and I found that later you wrote about Al-Farabi, life and work and significance.
Yes.
So how is this shift, shift from one end to the other?
Well, actually, no. I mean, that little book, Al-Farabi, the life, works and significance, actually, and expansion of the first chapter of my thesis, or my PhD thesis, or the first chapter of the book Classification of Knowledge. So expanded that, and right now I'm preparing for a new edition. Actually, the one in English, the new edition has come out. I added materials on the selections of wisdom from Al-Farabi, covering many different fields on politics, on the science, technology, on civilization, even on the international, international relations. Yes, that but I'm not preparing the Malay version, the Malay edition of that book. So people outside Malaysia know better, but it's not yet been translated into Malay language. So many Malaysians are not aware of that work. It's a bit, strange.
Yeah. So after this philosophy of Islam and classification knowledge in Islam, you're coming to the history of Malay archipelago, and also about the Southeast Asian Islam. And you have, I think, found a new way and new kind of narratives in this kind of Southeast Asian Islam. Could you explain that?
Well, I think it's a matter of time. I say, I started with the classification of knowledge, Islam, Tawhid, and science, and then I venture into the studies of Islamic civilization. So the unity of Islamic civilization naturally leads me to studies, leading me to studies of my own region in Southeast Asia, but of course, more precisely, it is the Malay-speaking, the Southeast Asia, which is often called the Malay world, the Malay-speaking world. It's a very important region, and I look at it as one of the major branches of Islamic civilization, almost as important as the other branches, such as the branch in the Indian subcontinent, and such as in the Central Asia, the Turkish-speaking branch, and the Persian-speaking branch, and then of course the various in Africa, and basically the continent, the whole continent, which is divided into several branches of Islamic civilization based on the ethnicity and different language groups. Yeah? So you had the Swahili and the Hausa, all that. So it's a fascinating study at the phenomena, as far as the phenomena of diversity in Islamic civilization, and yet there's the underlying unity. So I still consider myself as still neglecting my own region, but inshallah, in the remaining phase of my life, I perhaps write more about in Southeast Asia. But in my book, the Islamic civilization and the modern world, which has been translated into Turkish, this book carries 3 chapters that deal with Southeast Asia, with the Malay world. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, let's discuss more about the integration in Southeast Asia. There is also very much a matrilineal culture there in Malaysia and Indonesia. How do you observe that?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the what?
The matrilineal culture,
Yes.
Especially it's we can see all over this, maybe from Africa, Indian Ocean world, from Africa, and also in India, and then Malaysia and Indonesia.
What phenomena what you want me to address? What development?
Actually, the matrilineal societies, the women leading communities in Indonesia, yes. Malaysia, and it has some kind of.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting, I mean, when people look at the Malay world, meaning here the Malay-speaking world covering Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, Darussalam, the southern Philippines, the southern Thailand, and Singapore. These are where the Malays, the Muslims, are to be found. So in terms of that culture, basically in terms of gender relations, basically the role of women in public, that has been visible, for a long, very long time. Yeah. In other words, it's the coming of Islam to the Malay world. In a sense, gave a new kind of new awareness about religion, culture, about customs. There was something from the pre-Islamic tradition, which was found to be contrary against the teachings of Islam. But by and large, I mean, the pre-Islamic, the Islamic Malay cultures remained. Yeah, in other words, I would say that there was a very successful integration between the Islam and the local customs, and I would say that if you are looking about the public role of women, that has never been a problem really. That has never posed any legal problem or social problem. If there's been some neglect in the past, especially during the colonial time, this is something else. But the moment opportunities came for mass education, for the what they call this public service, then to the extent that they were qualified females, they were employed. So, and today, of course, I mean, they played a very, very important role in political domain. I would say that of all the Muslim countries, perhaps, in terms of numerical strength, in terms of numbers, we have more political leaders, more members of parliament, more ministers. And right now, increasingly, leadership in the civil service, in the fields of governance, even in the fields of law, judge, and in the Sharia, women are taking over. So in other words, when people were talking in the past, now how can women be employed in the Sharia courts, but now it's something generally accepted. And I would say in the coming years, it is the women who are going to dominate all sectors of life. It's going to be men who are going to be in a minority.
Yeah, Southeast Asia, we can see that it has its own uniqueness, especially in the dress code and the food culture, architecture, because they indigenize Islam over there. Could you give an insight on those things?
Sorry?
Give an insight to that dress code. It's very different from maybe Central Asia of the Muslim dress code.
That is true. But I think there's a greater tolerance in the local population for differences. In other words, in some areas, in some parts of the Muslim world, maybe the idea of, let's say, a woman wearing the scarf or wearing the tudung, if together with another woman who is, wearing the modern style, that may amaze some people in the West. How can these two coexist? And not only coexist, I mean, they are good friends. They work in the office. So that tolerance for that, in other words. So in other words, but you can observe that in terms of dress, in other words, more women, of course, opt for the traditional dress in other words, in conformity with the with the Sharia requirements. So but that's the thing. In other words, I have emphasized in my talks, in my writing. This is the beauty of this cultural diversity. The Muslim women observe the same principle. The principle is to, in other words, to preserve that not to be what we call the aurat. The aurat, in other words, is not to wear dresses that conform to the Islamic requirements. And that, of course, what is the style, the physical characteristic, that of course determined by climate, by cultural history. So we see diversity, we see differences between the women in Southeast Asia, and in one in Central Asia, and women in Africa. But the important thing to observe is that we are actually observing the same principle pertaining to trust. That applies to food, to other things. One more, this is another feature of Islamic civilization. Yeah, each region, based on language, but also based on the and giving rise to actually to different schools of thought. So in other words, you can imagine, and of course in our part of the world, it is the Shafi'i school of law that dominates. That dominates. You go to Africa, it's the Maliki. You go to the Indian continent, it's Hanafi. This is the destiny of the Muslim world, right?
Yeah, it's clear. So how about the architecture?
Same thing with architecture, but the variety. In this unity in variety. Yeah? If you look as well, of course, I mean, when you bring in the modern trends in architecture, then there's no difference between our region and other region. In other words, the modern architecture coming from the West, but to the extent that traditional architectures are still preserved, you can see, yeah, in other words, the Malay architectural tradition, which preserves the certain principles that today we say that in conformity with the ecological requirements. The ecology, in other words, the building styles, architecture are influenced by climate, yeah. This is basically by climate. Our part of the world is it's hot, yes, and it's hot, but and there's plenty of rain, yeah. So in the past, certain we call it Islamic cosmological principles shaped our architecture, including the mosque architecture. Yeah. So in the past, for example, it was common to see mosques not having domes, because domes are not part of our tradition. It's Eastern tradition, something sharing more affinities, more similarities, let's say, with the other Eastern Oriental architectures, as the Chinese and the Chinese, because Chinese Islam is one of China is one of the sources from which Islam came to our part of the world. So today we still have that. We still have dome architecture, yeah, dome, and also the various the different levels of roofs of the mosque. But I have argued then both are legitimate because, but they're different because they are based on different cosmological principles. Okay.
Yeah, great. And then when we come to the history of Islam in Southeast Asia, especially the inception of Islam, there are mostly those things are connected now, with the kingdoms and their acceptance of Islam. How about the community earlier there, the trading communities? They were traveling all over the world. Do you see that, there should have more studies on these kind of things?
Well, I think the subject of the coming of Islam to the Malay world has been has already seen a lot of publication, in the sense that I think there is a kind of consensus among the scholars, among historians, how Islam came to our part of the world, and why the Shafi'i school of law eventually emerged as the dominant school of law, why the Ansharite theology, Kalam, emerged as the dominant theology, and the dominance of the Sufis, of Sufism. Basically, I think the narrative, the popular narrative, which is accepted, is that the first people who propagate Islam in the region were traders and Sufis, and it happened that in many cases these two qualities, in the sense knowledge of this, the idea of practicing Sufis and the fact also they are traders, this was to be found in the same individual. In other words, the same individual can be a trader as well as a Sufi. So that was quite interesting phenomena. But of course, later on, in starting from the Portuguese, for example, the Portuguese came to our part of the world and conquered. They conquered Malacca. So Malacca was one of the earliest lands in the Muslim world which became colonized. But even after the coming of Portugal, followed by Spain, and then the Dutch, and then the British, the expansion of Islam did not stop, continued. Yeah, but since the Christian missionaries also arrived with the colonialists, so there was that tension and conflict between the two regions. But one thing that has surprised even some historians is that Islam was able to expand even when the region was divided and ruled by the different Western colonial powers. So that is basically that's what happened. And in modern times, of course, just like any other part of the Muslim world, the various streams of Islamic interpretation came to the region. So in that respect, there's no difference between the Muslims in Southeast Asia or in the Middle world and the other regions of the Islamic world. We are experiencing a confluence, of many currents of thought. So can be the good, it can be the peaceful one, but also now the extreme, the various extreme groups. Yeah. So you can name it. You just mention any extreme group, they're bound to have a few followers in every part of the world, including our part in our regions. So in other words, we are experiencing the same phenomena in the post-colonial era.
Yeah, great. How this fabric of Southeast Asian Islam helped for harmony and tolerance among these communities?
Yes, there is another aspect of Islam in our region. In other words, the experience of diversity. Let's take, for example, Malaysia. So Malaysia is a very multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. So because we have significant or substantial numbers of Chinese and from China who were brought by the British to work in the country, and then the Indian ethnic groups from India, from undivided India, and of course even from including from Sri Lanka. So these are the main groups. Yeah. But somehow, compared to many other parts of the world, we were able to escape the kind of social problems that appeared in other parts of the world. In Indonesia, for example, say for that incident in May 1969 when there was an ethnic clash, yeah, the country has not seen any inter-ethnic riots or anti-ethnic clashes, and the thing is, I think there's a greater tolerance, I would say, for diversity. Not only that, I think there's now dialogue is, comparatively speaking, dialogue is alive, and now under the new Prime Minister, Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim, talking now about the Madani policy, I can see a greater convergence of views among the different the segments, the different cultural segments of the country. So we'll see, but I think even in Indonesia also there's a quite good tolerance of diversity. So these are being the two largest Muslim countries in Southeast Asia. I think the two, if they cooperate, work together, they'll come up with a wonderful, I would say, scenario in the future regarding diversity, religious diversity.
Thank you so much for joining us, and even the Muslim communities around will be interesting to hear, your new projects. Let's end with that.
Inshallah.
So, what are the new projects you're working now?
Well, I have several books. I'm preparing the manuscripts of several titles. I think some of the main titles are, number one, is Tawheed and Social Science. Now I'm going to Tawheed and Social Science. Previously, I Tawheed and Science. So I got this manuscript, and then the second one, of course, the wisdom of dialogue, Islamic perspectives on the cultural diversity. That's also going to be an important work. Yes.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope we'll have more time together in future. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you very much.